With that, I'd like to introduce Ian Sheldon. Ian Sheldon is the Anderson's Professor in Trade here in the department. He's going to talk today about the interconnection of high food prices and riots with an emphasis on trade policy. And so with that, please give a warm welcome to Ian Sheldon.
Thanks very much, Matt. I'm the English guy that Doug Southgate was poking fun at earlier, so I'm going to speak in a very strange accent for the rest of my presentation. I grew up just south of London, so I'm going to talk like this so you can't stand a word I hear. All right? What Matt didn't tell you was you're supposed to take your 3D glasses out to watch the screen, and the numbers are just going to massively bounce out at you. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about high food prices today. The connection to riots relates to really the issue that politicians in developing countries really have to do something about high food prices, and you'll understand the connection that I've made later on. But the real point of the talk is to talk about the policies that developing countries have actually used to try to deal with high food prices in the context of what the so-called Washington Consensus has always told us developing countries should do. And then I'm going to compare those to the use of safety nets and come around at the end and say something moderately controversial about biofuels. And you'll see the connection later on. So earlier, I believe Dr. Southgate was talking about long-run trends in food prices and also forecasting out 50 years as to what he expects is going to happen to supply and demand over the next 50 years. What I'm interested in is the short term and what's been happening over the past 5 to 8 years. So since 2007, world food prices of what you might call key staple foods have been pretty volatile, but importantly, they've been quite volatile about relatively high levels. Now this is, if you looked at Doug's slides earlier, and I checked what he was presenting today earlier before I came over to the meeting, it's quite different to the pattern we've had over the past century, where real food prices have trended downwards. And I think Doug probably showed you a graph a little bit like this, that if you start out at the beginning of the century, everything's indexed to 100. If you were to run a line through this data, you'll see that the real price of food has trended downwards. We had a couple of big spikes, one in the 50s, one in the mid-1970s, and this is the more recent price spike that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this morning. Now, historically, if you go back and look at the data, we had price spikes. They were very intense, especially the one we had in the mid-1970s, but they've typically been quite infrequent. So over that 100-year period, you could see maybe 2 major price spikes. Since 2008, and I think this is the important point, is why I'm focusing on the short run, is that we've had 3 intense price spikes. One in early 2008, one in early 2001, and one in the third quarter of 2012. So here's a graph here. This is based on, I took this out of the latest FAO. That's a UN institution. This is FAO data. The red line is the index for food prices, and the blue line is the index for cereals prices. Those cereals prices are made up of maize or corn prices along with wheat and rice, and then it's a weighted index. And you can see this was the big run-up to the 2008 price spike. We then get a run down. We get a 2011 spike here, and then here's the 2012 spike. Remember, back over here, of course, you had that long-run downward trend in real prices that you see over here. So that second graphic is just expanding on the data from that graph there. Now, what many developing countries did in response to this was to directly intervene in their markets, in their domestic markets, in order to stabilize food prices. So you go back and look at the FAO data from 2008, 68 developing countries used trade policies, and I'll define what I mean by those trade policies in a minute, and 35 other developing countries released public stocks at subsidized prices. So these weren't private stocks being released by arbitrageurs taking advantage of high market prices. These were public stocks that were released and then sold to poor people at low prices. India's a pretty good example of where that policy was enacted. Now, my focus is mostly on trade policies, and what these trade policies have consisted of have been basically, if you're an exporting country, a major exporting country, you put in place export controls. So by export controls, you either imposed a tariff at the border on exports. You know, that would do what? That would provide you with a disincentive to export, pushes back that supply back into the domestic market, the objective being to push down domestic prices. Alternatively, you simply banned exports, or you imposed quotas or quantity restraints on those exports. That was pretty common, and you'll know in the 2010 price spike, several of the wheat exporting countries, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, also implemented export controls. On the other side of the equation, you have a large number of poor developing importing countries who either subsidized imports, so the objective there is to push the demand curve out, okay, and I'm going to show you in a minute that you just end up in this nasty prisoner's dilemma that you don't actually make anything worse, so you make into things considerably worse globally, or you could use tariff reductions. So if you have bound tariffs under the WTO rules, there's a certain amount of flexibility for lowering tariffs at the border to encourage imports from the world market, even though the world price has gone up. Now, in contrast to that, very few developed countries, by that I mean the USA, Canada, the EU, Australia, some of the big exporting countries, many of those countries typically did not implement any policies at the border to try to smooth out domestic prices. So typically in the US, the folks who bore the increase in food prices would have been livestock producers and to some extent consumers. Although remember, if you look at the food price index in the US, prices rose in 2008, 2009, maybe by about 2 to 4%. So grain prices, rice prices, whatever, tend to be a relatively small portion of what we consume at the supermarket. So exporting countries typically allowed their domestic producers to bear the cost of those higher prices. So let's think about what's happened in the context of standard policy advice from folks like the World Bank, the FAO, the IMF, Washington, D.C., you name it, the so-called Washington Consensus. So in the immediate post-war period, 1945 through to 1980, the focus globally was on price stability. So the argument was unstable prices are bad for both consumers and producers. People don't like volatility. The idea is, can we reduce variance in prices? And the way this was done was through a variety of policy instruments, but typically these would be production instruments. Think about set-aside here in the US. Think about set-aside in the European Union in the 1980s. The objective was to take surplus production out of the market, store it, keep up market prices, when, if you think about those real-world prices, they were declining throughout the post-war period. Policies were also implemented at the border. Typically, these would have been import tariffs or export subsidies. Import tariffs in the EU, import quotas here in the US for some commodities, export subsidies typically by the Europeans. The Europeans accounted for about 85 to 90% of the export subsidies used during the 1980s and the early 1990s. In addition, you had stock controls. And these were either done through public buffer stocks or through international commodity agreements. And most of those international commodity agreements no longer exist. If you follow these things, you'll know the multi-fiber agreement ended a few years ago. And that was the last major commodity agreement whose objective was to prevent price volatility, and largely the objective was to help producers, not consumers. Post-1980, most economists, and this would include Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winner, you probably read his name as a commentator, typically in the liberal media. Stiglitz and others, David Newbury, who's a professor at Cambridge, started arguing maybe price stability is no longer desirable. What we really want markets to do is for markets to work, where prices will signal shortages or surpluses. International trade does the job of shifting product around the world. And so the argument was that production decisions, trade decisions, and storage decisions, all those things that we'd interfered with in the post-war period, should be guided now by market prices. The policy advice was now use market-based risk management tools. And by that, I would mean futures markets, forward markets, crop insurance, revenue insurance, so-called markets for risk. These are markets that are typically considered to be incomplete. If you don't have those markets, you can't hedge against risk. Put those markets in place. On the other side, the argument was put in place safety nets. By safety nets, I mean food stamps, cash, direct transfers of food, and so on. I'm going to talk about safety nets in a minute. So in the 1980s, the 1990s, through to the middle of the 2000s, that was the standard policy advice. Don't interfere with prices. Find other tools for insurance, both for producers and consumers. All right? But this has drawn a lot of criticism over the past 4 or 5 years, both from the World Bank, the IMF, the FAO, and other commentators. And the criticism has been, and remember this relates to developing countries here, not so much developed countries, that after the price spikes, we observed that very often risk management tools simply weren't available to poor developing producers. Here in the US, you have futures markets, you have forward markets, you have crop insurance. And we've seen a huge increase in the take-up of crop insurance here in the US, and there's plenty of examples of subsidized crop insurance also in the European Union. But these tools are typically not available to poor developing country consumers and farmers. I'm going to talk a little bit about this later on, but it's also argued that many of these safety nets are too complex typically to ramp up. When you really need them, often these countries don't have enough money fiscally to ramp them up quickly in order to help people really in need. So it's all very well saying use safety nets, but if they're not actually being targeted when they're needed, you don't help poverty levels in countries suffering from price spikes. And the other piece of the story is the Washington Consensus, through trade liberalization, pushing countries to think more about using international markets. Some of the biggest losers from this are poor developing countries. Instead of focusing on self-sufficiency, we're told, think about using the world market as your insurance mechanism. They were the countries, the poorest food importing countries were the ones that were hurt most by these price spikes. And it's really interesting, I don't have a slide to show this, but if you go back 10 years, groups like the FAO were saying what? What we should worry about is low real food prices. This hurts poor exporting developing countries. Move forward 10 years, what's the FAO saying now? What we should be worrying about is high food prices because of the urban and rural poor in poor importing developing countries. So we have the same institution saying quite different things over the space of 10 years because real world food prices are doing something quite different in the last 5, 6, 7 years. What's the problem with higher food prices? Well, they clearly increase poverty in poor countries very sharply in the short run. And this is based upon a number of well-known studies by Will Martin and others at the World Bank. Now, in the long run, you would expect what? You'd expect supply response. But that's going to be a function of, in many poor countries, poor consumers are often producers. So their ability to respond to high prices of producers is going to be a function of whether they're net consumers or net producers. And we know from the data that in many of these poor countries, in the short run, high food prices, people want to eat, they don't have enough to produce and sell, so they need to consume. So you get these strong effects on poverty in the very short run, and even in the medium term as well. Now, we'd been led to believe, if you listen to people like President Sarkozy, and ex-President Sarkozy, I should say, Sarkozy back in 2008, 2009, at the big meetings in Rome at the FAO about food prices, said, we have to deal with food price volatility. Food price volatility is not what concerns consumers. If you think about it, if you're a poor consumer and you might die tomorrow because you're starving, the prospect of low food prices 5 years from now doesn't help, right? So what consumers really care about is their purchasing power and high food prices as opposed to food price volatility. And Mark Belmer, who's a researcher at Duke University, came out with a very interesting paper, and he has another one that's in Foreign Affairs, where they actually ran simple correlation between food riots and food prices and food price volatility, accounting for the possibility that there had been a nasty weather shock at the same time. And he found a pretty high correlation between high food prices and the extent of food riots. Now, I have a crude graphic here. This is one I found in a paper where this is, again, this is the food price index. This is the 2008 spike. This is the 2010 spike. And these are all the various riots. The red lines are where the riots occurred. You can't see the numbers very well in brackets. So there are a number of deaths due to those food price riots. And over here, if you look carefully, this would be the Arab Spring in here. Now, I'm not suggesting this is a clear evidence of causation, but if you just look at the data, just eyeballing it, it would suggest that food price riots have something to do with high food prices. Okay? Now, the political argument then would be, in poor countries, intervention then becomes a matter of political survival. If you have large, poor populations, you have to be seen to be doing something about high food prices if you want to survive either a coup d'etat or you want to survive electorally if you're in a democracy. And there's a couple of good examples here that get cited in the literature on this. The Indian Prime Minister and the Indonesian President were both re-elected in 2009 after they had campaigns that emphasized their ability to limit the damage caused by the food price crisis. So in the Indian case, the Prime Minister put in place export controls on rice. Rice prices went up about 160% globally. He kept down rice prices considerably lower than that inside of India. And he boasted about it at the election, as politicians are wont to do. Now, many of these poor countries then didn't do what the Washington Consensus told us to do. They didn't let world market prices work. They didn't have access to risk management instruments, and they didn't have particularly good food safety nets in place, although I'm going to say something about that later on. So what they did was implement these trade policies. And many of them believed that they had insured themselves against high world food prices. The problem is that one small developing country that restricts its exports typically doesn't have much effect on world prices. But if a large number of countries together implement trade policies, they can distort international prices by more than they would have otherwise been if they just let markets work on their own. Now, a country like India, one of the largest rice exporters in the world on a very thin global market, they alone can affect the world price, and they certainly did. So I have a quote here from Pascal Lamy, the current Director General of the WTO, is export restrictions play a direct role in aggravating food crises. So remember, these export controls weren't the reason for food price spikes in the first place. They're a response to food price spikes, and they exacerbate those food price spikes. Okay? And here I have an example of 3 different spikes in rice, wheat, and maize prices. 40% of the spike in rice prices was due to export controls, 19% in wheat, 10% in maize. And again, this is data from Kim Anderson through his World Bank project. So you have a nasty collective action problem here. When you go to the football stadium, one of you stands up to watch the play, that's great. That's the analogy to somebody restricting their exports. But what tends to happen? Everybody stands up and you're no better off. Will anybody unilaterally sit down? I've tried at pop concerts and told the person in front, and I'm usually abused pretty thoroughly as a result. I remember doing it at a Bob Dylan concert. You know, I'm an old hippie dude, you know. This guy gets up in front of me. I said, "Can you sit down?" He said, "It's a rock concert, man." I said, "This is Bob Dylan. We just sit down and chill out, you know." There's a collective act. It's the prisoner's dilemma. Unilaterally, you have an incentive to do this, but everybody's worse off if everybody does it. Okay? So I'm going to give you a little lesson in economics here. And I think I'm going to get it right compared to Doug Southgate, who got it the wrong way around this morning. He's not there to defend himself, so I've just come from an economics class, so I apologize, and there won't be a test on this afterwards. So I'm going to imagine this is the market for rice. Okay, so on my vertical axis, I have the price of rice. Along here, I have the quantity of rice. So there's my supply curve. And think of that supply curve as being the world supply curve, including the shock that's already occurred. So that supply curve maybe lay somewhere over here in the early 2000s, and it shifted that in that direction for the reasons that maybe Doug talked about as to why we've had high food prices. Okay? Here's your demand curve. Okay? That means you have, this is much is sold on the world rice market, and this is the world price, and this is also the domestic price of rice. Remember, it's free trade, markets work. Okay? So all those countries that I told you about that implemented export controls, they do that. So their supply curve shifts up. It's just a crude parallel shift implying they tax each unit of exports. So if you tax exports, what do you think happens to quantities? Well, there's less rice on the world market. Here. The world price goes up here. But of course, you now have a bunch of rice slushing around on the domestic market. What does it do to the domestic price? It drives it down. So you've apparently achieved the effect that you set out to achieve, which is to lower domestic prices. But of course, what are you doing to the world price? You're actually making the world price increase even worse. So what happens then is those poorer importing countries do what? They step in and use import policies on the demand side. So their demand curve shifts out to the right. And what I've done is I've said there's an exact offset of the supply shift by the demand shift. The net result is to do what? Here's the new world equilibrium up here. You've just ended up, you have the same quantity on the world market, because supply shifted, demand shifted. All you've done is drive up the world price, and you haven't actually reduced the domestic prices back to where it was to start with. Yep. So each country has a unilateral incentive to do that, because if they don't, what do they know is going to happen? Everybody else is going to do it, so the price is going to go up. Everybody's going to stand up in the football stadium. So let's talk a bit about safety nets, and then I'll finish off. The stabilization policies that we talked about in before the 1980s, but more recently, there's a mixed record on how they work. Buffer stock policies, Luther probably can talk more about this than I can. Buffer stock policies that we used in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s didn't work very well. Public stocks tend to crowd out private stocks, and you end up shooting yourself in the foot. Now, that's led to a focus on these risk management tools, and in developing countries, particularly on safety nets. These safety nets are non-contributory, so the poor people don't actually have to pay taxes towards them. Targeted transfers, so they're not blanket transfers to everybody. They're designed to provide assistance to the very poor following price shocks. And they take various forms. Direct cash transfers, food stamps, you'd be familiar with those here in the US, food for work programs, cash for work programs. The idea is to provide insurance to the very poor who have limited access to more formal mechanisms for coping. So if you're a poor rural farmer who's a net consumer, you don't have access to futures markets, you don't have access to crop insurance if you're on the production side, and you don't have much access to insuring yourself. So the argument is that they provide a mechanism for the poorest of the poor to cope. Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize in the 1990s, famously wrote in his book on famines, it's not food supply that matters, it's access to food supply matters. In other words, you can have starvation with plenty. In other words, it's your entitlements to that food that matters, your ability to pay for that food that matters, not whether there is or isn't a shortage of food. So if you give people cash transfers, you maintain their purchasing power. Often these have been used to complement stabilization policies. India is a good example. And that's because stabilization policies may simply be insufficient to protect the purchasing power of the poor. And to give you evidence that these were used, the 2000-2008 price spike, again, this is the FAO, 23 countries used cash transfers, 19 used food assistance, 16 chose policies to increase disposable income. Safety nets have been pretty crucial in protecting the poor from price increases. And this is an example down in Mexico that's called the Progreso program. This is a conditional cash transfer program. They don't just give you cash to help you keep up your purchasing power. You give you cash. Mothers have to make sure their kids go to school. Mothers have to have health checkups and so on. The idea is that you can improve the living conditions of the poor, not just by giving them cash, but asking them to do something for that cash. And the Mexican program is held up as being a very good example of how these programs might work. There's a lot being written in the literature about options for transfers are also improving. And I heard about this at a meeting in the summer and I didn't believe it. In India, private mechanisms have been put in place where they've got bioinformation on people in the country. They're putting in bank accounts in place so that they can straight cash transfer to those people's bank accounts. I'm even seeing stories about if you have a smartphone, they can send you a digital image that you take, presumably to a food market or whatever. So people are starting to use remember, cell phones are not just for us in developed countries. They're everywhere. And so there are technologies that have been put in place to help much more efficient direct transfers than some of the other mechanisms that are in place in countries like India. So why are safety nets not used more often? I mean, I gave you some examples, but there weren't as many countries that used safety nets as used export policies. Well, they're very hard to scale up, and they're hard to scale down, and how do you target people in need? Also, they're fiscally constrained, many of these economies. So if you've got an economy that's facing high food prices, right, potentially you're in a recession as well, the fiscal take by the government is typically going to be what we call pro-cyclical. So the revenue intake's going down at the wrong time when you need to target those rising food prices. So many of these poor countries are finding it difficult to implement safety nets. And very often trade policies are a lot less costly. If you tax exports, it's a revenue maker, not a revenue taker, right? Now, obviously, if you use import subsidies, it costs you money. I've got a couple more slides, Matt. It's also very politically popular to use these export policies because often safety nets leave some portion of the middle class unprotected. So you have a targeted safety net. You may have an income that's above that safety net, but you're still in an area where you don't have enough food to eat and you're unable to deal with that risk. And so an additional policy in the form of an export control drives down domestic prices and is very popular amongst those middle class. However, you should remember that these policies, safety nets, in and of themselves, can distort prices. Internationally, there's a possibility that they lead to less exports. If you give people income, you shift their demand curve, you drive up their demand domestically, it pulls product back out of the world market, that pushes up the world price. Equally, if you're an importing country, it leads to more imports and again drives up the world price. But the evidence suggests that trade policies tend to overreact, so they tend to push up prices more than they need to be pushed up. Yes, they're counter-cyclical, but they overreact, while safety nets tend to underreact, and they underreact because of this fiscal constraint. Now, trade policies seem to have been successful in stabilizing domestic prices, but as I showed you, you simply end up making the world price spike worse. This is a prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma, two guys do a bank robbery, both get caught, get put in separate cells, having their fingernails pulled out, and they're asked, confess or don't confess. They're both better off colluding to not confess before they got caught. They both end up confessing, that's the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma here is, if you don't put in place export controls, import controls, the other guys will, and you'll be worse off. So you need some sort of solution to that. That's cooperation through some sort of self-enforcing agreement, and the obvious example here will be the WTO. Now, the current Doha round, if you follow these things, it's not going anywhere right now. It's probably it's in cold storage, I would suggest. It's pushing for reductions in tariffs and disciplines on export subsidies. Why? Because that's what the developed countries did in the 80s and the 90s. Many developed countries are also pushing for tighter disciplines on the use of these export restrictions. It's very surprising to find out the WTO has never paid, and the GATT, the predecessors of the WTO, never paid any attention to restrictions on exports. Now we want to put disciplines in place, but many developing countries, these politicians are savvy, they figure out, I have to be seen to be doing something quickly in response to high food prices. I don't want to be disciplined by the WTO in my use of that instrument because it's the only instrument that's available to me. Now, to be fair to developed countries, none of them used export policies in response to the current food price spike. You have to go back to the mid-1970s. The Europeans used export taxes in the 1970s. And Luther, was that when we had the ban on exports of oilseeds? Was that in the 70s? Yeah, that in the US. And you can't do that now, right? Is that correct? The embargo, that was the word I was looking for. We haven't seen developed countries do this at all in the current price spike. But most of the pressure for use of export disciplines is coming from developed countries. And here's what I want to say that's maybe somewhat controversial. Developed countries have policies on biofuels. Most of these biofuels policies have had very large terms of trade effects, both for coarse grains, oilseeds, and sugar. Biofuels policies have pushed up world prices, maybe by as much as 35 to 40% in the 2008 price spike. We have mandates in place here in the US and the European Union for biofuels. What that tends to mean is that supply of grains going into biofuels tends to be very unresponsive to the world food price. You have to meet a mandate, so even though world prices may be moving up, you have to meet that mandate, and as a result, it's very hard for biofuels policies to act like a buffer stock mechanism would and moderate increases in world food prices. So what I'm going to end up arguing in that last bullet point is that maybe we should think about revisiting biofuels policies. Now, I understand the political economy of having those policies in place, but I have to wonder whether we should be focusing on developing those second-generation biofuels that will have a considerably lower distorting effect on world prices. Second-generation biofuels would be biofuels that aren't taking feed grains, human consumed commodities out of the market and distorting world markets, but you'd use maybe cellulosic ethanol. Right now, this is probably a pipe dream, if I understand the technology, but maybe as a society here in Europe and in the US, we would be better off using public policies to stimulate R&D in that direction. And on that point, Matt, I'm going to finish and be willing to take some questions. Unless people want to ask Carl some questions, of course. Thank you.
A couple of questions. Ian, I'd like to publicly point out, Ian did finish not only on time, slightly under time since we started late. So just, you know, it's always nice to hear his dulcet tones. He was a little frugal with them this morning. So if you have any questions, comments.
Dr. Sheldon,
yeah.
Could you expound a bit on your apparent conclusion that the food price spike in 2011-12 was the cause of the Arab Spring uprisings rather than just frustration of these countries of decades of political repression?
Sure. I remember what I said. I showed you a graph, right? And there appears to be a correlation. Now, whether high food prices explicitly caused the riot, and remember, not all those riots were in the Middle East. There were riots in Mexico, the tortilla riots in 2008. No, it would be wrong for me. If I was to run a proper statistical analysis on this, I'd say, you know, what else might cause riots? So food prices would be one factor. I'd want to take account of weather shocks and what's happening on global markets. And most importantly, I'd want to take account of the political system. So in India, of course, you have a democratic political system. Politicians take pretty quick account of what the poor population is saying to them in terms of concerns about high food prices. The argument that the Arab Spring was entirely due to high food prices would be misleading. But I think the graph shows you that, you know, if you were looking for a cause, then maybe part of it was high food prices. The difference is, of course, you can't run for people weren't running for re-election in those countries, so it was hard for them to be seen to be doing something about it in a democratic setting. Yeah?
What's the production response in these hungry countries?
Well, that was the point I made earlier, that in terms of the poverty effects, in the short run, most of these countries are what we call net consumers. So remember, think about a country that has a lot of smallholder farmers who both produce for themselves and for the market. In many instances, they're often short of food that they can actually sell, and so in the short run, they don't respond to high food prices.
So what's it take to get them to respond?
They typically, in the medium term, the long term, you do get a response, and we know that from looking at countries like Vietnam, that those high rice prices over a couple of growing seasons. I mean, remember, rice you can double, if not triple crop. You've ever seen what China looks like or Vietnam looks like? Have you ever looked at the nitrogen application rates in some of these rice-producing countries? Yes, they do respond, but not all of them do. Some of these countries are not self-sufficient in food, so they're unable to have a production response. So it varies from country to country, depending on whether you're a net exporter or a net importer. Yeah?
Where do you see modern agricultural technology entering
There's, you know, every policy document I read says in the medium to long term, that's obviously a very important part of the solution, which is what Dr. Southgate was talking about, which was, remember, these food price pressures are probably not going to go away, at least in the next 10 to 15 years, largely because of demand growth in Southeast Asia, rundown of global stocks, biofuels, weather shocks, fertilizer prices, you name it. There's a whole, and these export controls. One of the things we don't hear so much discussion about is public expenditure on R&D in agriculture has massively gone down over the last 20, 25 years. Now, some of that's been replaced by the Monsantos and the biotech industry. But if we go and look at the productivity gains for what was called the Green Revolution, these were typically high-yielding rice and wheat varieties that were brought in, in the late 60s, early 70s. We've seen the production gains from those commodities, but they were all typically publicly funded, based on publicly funded research. And that's a big concern that groups like CIMMYT and the other groups around the world, the Rice Research Institute, are underfunded, and there's a gap. Can we expect the private sector to jump in? Now, this sounds like this is self-serving. Obviously, this is a College of Ag. I'd love them to dump a few $1 million into high-yielding rice production, and maybe with a biotech tweak to it. But so you're right. I think, but the production doesn't solve whether you starve today. Remember what I said at the beginning. This is how do you respond in the short term to price spikes when consumers' purchasing power gets really significantly decreased. I think there was Bill.
How do you keep a safety net easy to attend?
If you notice, it's got to be counter-cyclical, right? What that means is you kick it in when you really need it, and you take away when you don't need it. And yes, you're absolutely right, and that's one of the reasons why these safety nets have not been used as frequently. I don't think it's as much because these politicians understand that you get dependency. I think it's because they simply can't ramp it up in the short run to meet that price spike. And it's interesting to see, The Economist had an editorial, I just read it this morning whilst I was sitting in my student's exam, about India. India has had these food stores, rationing systems, buffer stocks. The problem with those systems is that they keep prices low for everybody. So it's not just the poor that become dependent, it's everybody in the middle class, however they define the middle class in India, right? And so the argument is with these modern technologies, we might be able to do a better job of targeting both when we need it and when we don't need it. But you're absolutely right. But what's the alternative? Do you want them to use export policies? I mean, if we want these guys to be players in the WTO, they need to commit to what the WTO is about, which is disciplines on trade-distorting border policies and domestic farm policies. I think I saw a... Do you want to take one more or you want to finish?
Yeah, let's go. That's right.
I think that was it.
All right.
I'm giving Luther a chance.
Could you say something about the prospects for a successful multilateral trade negotiation round?
Will there be a successful round of negotiations in the WTO, the Doha round? Will the Doha round be completed? Well, one day I wake up and I'm optimistic, the next day I wake up and I'm pessimistic. I'm optimistic in the sense that if I look at the negotiating document that the Commissioner has put in place, the General Secretary of the WTO has put in place. The Europeans have agreed to cut tariffs. They've agreed to put all export subsidies on the table for negotiating away. The US yet still hasn't resolved the cotton case. They've bought off Brazil, but it's still potentially there. The real problem is countries like India who want special and differential treatment. And right now, with the global recession, Indian economic growth, I think, was really slowing down in the last few months from what I saw on the TV the other morning. I'm not very optimistic right now. But I think, and right now, the big players in the WTO are whom? The US, Japan, the EU, and the large developing countries like Brazil, China, and India, and maybe Russia. Russia's now a member of the WTO. It's formally acceded to the WTO. In the US, we have creeping growth, right? Despite what they told you in the election, there is a little bit of economic growth. I saw capital stock purchase figures were up. But what about the EU? I don't see the EU coming to the negotiating table when the Eurozone at any moment could disappear down the proverbial. Just stop myself being rude there, all right? Japan is Japan is still suffering from Japan's sclerosis, I would guess. So I don't think there's the political will in many countries right now to pursue a multilateral trade agreement. And I think it's going to be difficult if the pressures on developing countries to liberalize their trade all the time, biofuels policies or other policies that are still distorting international markets are in place. I think there's more hope, rightly or wrongly, for regional free trade agreements. I think we've seen a big pickup in numbers of free trade agreements compared. I'd like to see multilateral because I think the global spaghetti bowl is just getting more entangled all the time. That's a reference to all these bilateral free trade agreements. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks very much.